Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out of procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today is the first of 3 bonus episodes that I thought I would publish this week as we get closer to 2022, reflecting on sessions that I have particularly enjoyed during our major flagship events of 2021. And this first episode is from Mastermind LIVE Spring 2021, which we held back in March of this year. I've been spending a lot of time during 2021 thinking about category management. Is it fit for purpose, or does what is essentially a 25-year-old business process need to evolve as procurement changes? And so I invited 2 CPOs, Nancy Nicoll, the VP of Indirect Sourcing Center of Excellence at Retail Business Services, and Jaime Robles, the CPO of Casey's General Stores, to join me on a panel session where I posed that very question. All right, let's hit play on the session. So I want to, first of all, thank you both for joining us today. And, for the start of the conversation, I just want to give some context to all of the folks who are joining us in the session. Nancy, you're a VP of Not for Retail and Indirect at Retail Business Services, which is a services company of Ahold Delhaize. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about kind of the context of what your organization looks like right now, and kind of from a structure perspective as well.
Absolutely. So we are a post-merge organization, meaning that about 4 years ago, Delhaize and Ahold merged to form the new company known as Ahold Delhaize. And Retail Business Services was formed simultaneously, as you mentioned, Phil, to be a kind of a services arm to the great local brands in which we serve here in the U.S. So you may know us as Stop and Shop, Food Line here in the South, Giant Company, Giant Food, or Hannaford Brothers are the 5 brands. When I formed this organization, I really was faced with this challenge. I'm actually very interested in this conversation because I took really the best of both organizations to form what we call this new NFR organization. Both structures were previously very category centric, meaning we had category teams. So the decision that I made at the time was to bring them together, but I would also contend, and I believe quite strongly, that what got us here isn't what's going to make us successful even 2 or 3 years from now. So right now we are a category focused team, meaning that I have my team oriented around specific areas of indirect spend. So things like marketing and merchandising, supplies and packaging, corp services, et cetera. Very successful in the sense that we have built great stakeholder partnerships. And I do believe a cornerstone of our work and our success is really hinged upon our ability to form great stakeholder partnerships. So that's kind of an overview as to how we're structured today. Hopefully that answers the question in terms of how you were asking it.
It does. Thank you, Nancy, because I've got to come back to a few of those things. But first of all, I want to ask Jaime the same, because you've got a very different situation at Cases. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about your procurement organization or where you are in the procurement kind of organizational maturity journey at Cases.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you, Phil, and glad to be here. And nice to meet you, Nancy. So last year I joined Casey's. Casey's is it's a retail convenience store with almost 3,000 stores across the Midwest. And Casey's didn't have a procurement organization in place, a formal procurement organization in place. Historically, the company just have all the functions doing the whole procurement aspect of it. And that's why I joined the organization, to build them from scratch, to build them from the ground, to create the centralized strategic sourcing team. And we didn't have a standardized process, and the company was missing all the leverage of scale. So we kind of have, I wouldn't say a white canvas, but we have a PO factory, and we have to give it a proper formal process in place to build a procurement team for this. So we're building a technology-centric organization with a strong procurement team as a strategic sourcing experts, not subject matter experts. We are putting the data in the middle of everything and the decision-making, bringing the best-in-breed offerings that are in the market in technology-wise for procurement, and develop those strategies around it for the procure to pay, source to pay, contract lifecycle management, vendor master data, supplier networks. And that's how we are approaching this transformation for the company.
So as you're thinking about that from taking a sourcing-led approach versus a category-led, kind of what's the thinking around doing that?
Yeah, so the way we're doing this is we started with the technology. We're building the foundation of procurement. The foundation of procurement for us is how do we operate day to day, and that is the procure to pay process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we operate every single day? How do we start from sourcing all the way to pay in the whole company? That is our foundation. Let's build the foundation. That is technology oriented, that is data oriented, that is everything on its core. Then we operate into this ERP and enterprise standard. And now how do we build a team around all that? How do we go for the category management, and we divided the whole company between direct and indirect, and then what is plastics and miscellaneous and facilities and legal and marketing and all stuff? Or should we have all the data in the middle and we access all that and we have a more self-service model? That's what we're going after. We believe that with the access to data these days, and if you put the technology on its core and you bring all those ancillary systems, technology solutions, everybody with access to that data could take a really good decision in terms from the strategic sourcing perspective, or from the customer oriented perspective, or the function or the stakeholder. That's how we're building the team here in Casey's. People that are not experts in specific categories,
Mm-hmm.
but people that are experts in strategic sourcing and with access to analytics and data to take those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, you kind of talked at the beginning about you're a big believer of what got you here might not be the thing that's best for the future. You know, as you think about category management specifically and how you use category management today, what are some of the things that maybe that you're looking at thinking, you know what, I'm not sure if that is part of our future, or those are challenges that category structure brought to us that maybe we need to find a way to overcome?
You know, it's interesting, Phil. I think for me, the reason we got into category management was because at the time we thought it was efficient. It was an efficient way to be able to drive results. But I absolutely hear the need for data. And I think kind of the struggle that we've had, and I'll speak for my own organization, in the last really 3 to 4 years is we are not subject matter experts in a category. So I'll pick marketing and merchandising. I have a team that's very oriented and very knowledgeable on that topic, but we're never going to compete with our business partners in terms of subject matter expertise. So I believe our expertise is in strategic sourcing.
Yeah.
And we have enough what we call functional knowledge and expertise to work and partner with our stakeholders to drive great outcomes. But I think that's sort of the tension in the model that Jaime is really speaking to, is that the reality here is just category management and building great relationships isn't going to drive the kinds of value that our organizations now demand from us. So I think, you know, as I've said to Phil before, delivering results and delivering savings is essentially the price of admission for what we all do now. The reality is we have to be able to grow that value equation. And I think data and ability to manage and maximize data within a category structure, perhaps not as it looks today, Phil, but maybe an evolution. So what I think I'm kind of seeing for my own organization is sort of a kind of next iteration of what we're seeing today in category management, with much more of what Jaime spoke to in terms of data being the center letter, kind of the centerpiece of that structure.
Mm-hmm. So is there a role for an expert, for a subject matter expert in procurement then? Or are you looking to kind of, and when I say expert, I mean, you know, that deep expertise of somebody who really understands every single nut and bolt of the category as much as, if not even more than in some cases, the stakeholders that they're working for? Or are you looking, let's get that insight somewhere else, and we'll help kind of leverage this ecosystem behind us and this partner network or this data or whatever it looks like to empower the folks that we do have who are more relational?
You know, and I think, Phil, it's interesting because I'll go back to the merger. We inherited certain parts of, I'll call it a procurement function, with really deep subject matter expertise. Utilities and energy was an area that not only were we sourcing energy, but we were, in fact, the functional experts regarding energy. And I think that really comes down to the paradigm of what are we? Yeah. So are we sort of a hybrid of other areas of the organization? These weren't good fits. So perhaps we took them on because we always deliver great results. But for me, I think it's really being very true to the mission of what we do and what we are. We're procurement, we're sourcing. We have to keep that lens very clear, or the reality is we're going to get kind of muddy and murky again in terms of some of these other areas. But to answer your question specifically, I don't think, and this is hard for me to say, but I don't think we want to become subject matter experts in any of the categories in which we source or the spend in which we address. I think we have to continue to hone, kind of keep the knife sharp on the fact that our expertise has to be in sourcing and procurement.
Now, sorry, go ahead, Jaime.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on Nancy, and she's totally right. Just to add, I believe there's a differentiation between indirect and direct as well. So that is something that we also need to be aware, because I crush the heart of some of my colleagues out there where they are category managers and say, are you kidding me? You cannot get rid of category management in this specific area of industry or a niche commodity. Yeah, of course, there's some, we need to differentiate between direct and indirect. So in indirect, I think Nancy and I are completely on the same page, and that is something that we were driving very effectively, both of us. In the direct side, I do believe that we still can make it, but there are some niche specific industries, heavily regulated categories, for instance, that are more complicated, right, to manage, to discuss, to leverage. And even in those categories, I still see the opportunity for the category management role to evolve, to become, they were there to generate price savings by leverage of scale and growing volumes, and mostly on global markets. So that needs to evolve completely through the stages of maturity and become more, more instead of task-driven to automated rule-based creation. So that is the differentiation that I would say as well for the category management role.
Yeah, in a direct role, I spent some time earlier in my career in the automotive business, and I was a category lead in a number of different categories on the direct side. Honestly, I didn't have any idea about the technical side of the category, and the approach that I took was it's much more about a relationship and helping those engineers and those, because those truly are subject matter experts who are, in those larger companies, some of the best in the world at what they know. But our job becomes, how can we help enable them to become more successful by understanding how to think bigger about a market, as opposed to just kind of one-dimensional about the thing that they want to buy in that moment.
And I believe that is where the whole conversation becomes more, rather than I am the category manager and I manage this spend in this category, through more how do I implement an effective top-notch supply relationship management program that involves my business partners, the functions where I find many times that are the truly experts, and they are part of the whole strategy from the very beginning, from conceptual phase to creation to execution. And I am more an orchestra maestro here, moving all the ways around, and I am a sourcing expert. That's the way that I see it.
Phil, can I ask a question, though? Because I do see some interesting things going on in the chat, and I think it's a really good point has been made. I do think category management lends itself to the ability to stay close to the business, because the real risk for me here is if we get so far away from the business, we lose sight of really what are the strategic initiatives that we're ultimately here to support. Because the reality is that's what I think partnership behavior really demonstrates. We stay close to the business, we stay close to initiatives. Tim made the comment about if you stay close to the category, you can find those hidden levers of where to deliver value. And I think there's absolute truth in that. But I do think you can have the best of both. I do think you can have I call it hybrid category management, again, different than the way I'm currently managing it today, still have those relationships, still have that kind of closeness to the business, but still have data and data-driven decisions be the centerpiece. I think that's really, again, I'll call it the tension in the model. That's really, I think, what we're all trying to drive towards, or at least should be thinking about.
That's a very interesting point, Nancy. And when I was at GE and Philips, when the whole organization was category management driven, and in fact, being category management organized structure took us further from the business, because I have category managers thinking that I own this category, I own this spend, and I'm the one dictating kinda what is the strategy. And if we remove that mindset and saying, well, you're not category manager, you're a strategic sourcing expert, that is going to bring you closer to the business, in fact, because you will need to build all these strategies with the function and involve your vendors and partners into the whole creation of all this. So in fact, I think removing that mindset will help to be closer to the business.
So I have a follow-up question then, Jaime, on that. So, I think one of the reasons we put category management in place is because, like I say, for this illusion of being closer to the business, but I think you're absolutely right. The amount of times I see a category strategy that's built and presented as fact, with very little impact, very little input from the stakeholders themselves, and they look at it and like, what the heck? This is nothing to do with what my strategy is. Well, but it's going to save you 10%. So here it is. As you think about going in a sourcing first model, because you're really building that from scratch, how do you convince the stakeholders that the value that you bring goes beyond, running a transaction, running a sourcing process, that you can bring value that is more strategic without necessarily having that interface of category management as the way to go and do it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. And how many times in our careers we just go by with a category strategy document and we go to the stakeholder and say, now we're going to use this carrier or this shipping company, and that is going to cost them more. Hey, but in France it's going to be cheaper. So overall in the whole globe, we're going to save 10%. Yeah, but for that factory, for that place, it's not working, right? They better stay with their local carrier. Yeah, that's nonsense at all for me. So how do you convince the function? Pretty much is through collaboration. I mean, every time I see that conversation with the different functions and our business partners, they are part of the whole conceptual phase creation of all this. And they see the top vendors at the table, and we bring the real experts of that product or that service to the table to help us to develop the category. So the value that they see on us is not only bringing the parts together, but also using economies of scale for the company, because many times everybody's so disconnected. And what you're using here, and we got 20 different vendors in the company where we can put all that into one basket. I mean, building those strategies about bringing the teams together, I think that's a tremendous value that you see on that. Now, we are not getting rid of the negotiation process. That's still gonna be there. And you need true professionals in negotiations to conduct those. So that is part of the value that you can bring to the table.
Now, Nancy, do you think, jumping on the point of negotiation, but it's a great point, Jaime, and I'm looking at the comments as we're talking, and there's a lot of, I don't want to say pushback, but thoughts around that need for expertise. And as you think about negotiation, can you have an effective negotiation if the person that's doing the negotiating doesn't necessarily understand the category? I guess is just a leading question, but I want to follow that up with another one, Nancy, which is, where do you get that expertise from, therefore, if it's not necessarily living in the person that's running the sourcing process?
That was a leading question, Phil. I would say a couple things. I would say, to me, this is all about how you set up yourself for success. So I think you can't determine, you can't be making kind of the decisions about roles and responsibilities at the end of the process or at the negotiation table. All those decisions have to be made up front, both in collaboration with your stakeholder, how you're going to approach the market, what you really consider to be best outcomes. And the thing that I would add to what Jaime mentioned about how you get stakeholder buy-in, to me, an important part of our success is essentially shared outcomes or shared targets. So it's not just a sourcing or procurement target, it's an organizational target that we share with our brands and business. So we're working together in true spirit of partnership to deliver best outcomes, and therefore we can then make best choices. So we can actually talk about what the various scenarios are. In terms of, can you actually negotiate without having expertise? I think I hate to say it, but it's almost every event's different. Every situation's different. I would say, as a rule, there are some categories that do require expertise. You're going to need to understand certain categories of spend, but can you do that in partnership with your business owner stakeholder? Yes, because again, I think one of the risks for us in this category management structure is we start competing with our business owners to be subject matter experts. Yeah. And I think you have to be really clear on your roles and responsibilities in terms of what you own, what's important in the negotiation table versus what the stakeholders' point of view is or their expertise. I think this is sort of the, I talked before about, what's gotten us here isn't going to get us to where we need to go to. This is really the crux of it for me, because if we continue to stay in this very category driven, Jaime kind of mentioned, specific, merchandising, marketing, all these various areas, I think we kind of get stuck and get in our own way a little bit, and we lose sight of the larger value creation that we can do if we look at, again, a very data-driven culture. But it's a very long way of saying, I think you need it, but I think you've got to be really clear and crisp on what your roles and responsibilities are, and also somewhat driven by category.
So then, as you're thinking about metrics and having different metrics, are you thinking that from a business unit perspective, and for you in the case of retail, it could be, retailer 1 within the chain has certain metrics, retailer 2 within the chain does, or even IT does versus HR benefits does versus, and the list goes on. So being very specific with each individual stakeholder about what success means for them.
Exactly. And we use an idea here called total cost of ownership. So we're never going to look at lowest cost. We really want to understand what are the value drivers in a choice or a decision. And we put tension on those to really better understand if someone says, well, I like my incumbent better. He's a good person. He's delivered great results. We really need to quantify that and really put tension on the business owner in terms of considering alternative solutions. I think, though, that, again, this is part of the legacy of procurement. I think we've all been very successful as essentially an industry or discipline, but the reality is we're carrying some baggage. And I think what you're speaking to, Phil, is part of our baggage that we've got to decide if we want to leave at the door or we want to take with us because it served us.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. One is a mindset thing of we actually have to believe in ourselves in what we can deliver as procurement organizations and get out of that old mindset. But kind of my follow-up question on metrics is, how do you convince the CFO that actually taking an approach which may be more of a balanced scorecard and it's going to differ from business unit to business unit is the right way for you to bring most value to the business versus the CFO looking and saying, I just want this number? Or is the reality the CFO is going to say, I want this number? And that's something that you as a procurement leader has to balance within that and just, build it so you're going to hit that number, but that number isn't everything for you. Or it's not, the guiding light. And once you've hit that number, you can say, okay, I'm done. I'm going to wait for my number next year.
Yeah, you're right. But I think we will need a different forum to have that conversation about how to convince the CFO about the whole value that we can bring to the table. But you're totally right. And Nancy is spot on. The legacy procurement structure that we are facing. I mean, if we think about this for a second, so category management, whenever somebody talks about your category manager, the first thing that comes to your mind is because that person has expertise and has data about that specific category. And that is exactly what we need in 1982, right? So because we didn't have access to all that data that easy as today. Today, you just give it a computer to somebody and they will mine all the data you want. I think the problem is not how much data do we have, because now we got excess of data, is that what do you do with the data? So that is where the category manager was, I think, the created, and an expertise for me is data. Simple as that. Now, if you have access to that data through a technology-centric organization where you can access that information, then you can act upon that data if you have the expertise on what to do with it. But if you don't have access to the technology, to the data, to the analytics, to the information, then it makes it really complicated. Then you need to rely into a category manager to tell you how much you should pay for this item or this service. That is how all this was created. And I think that is how we are evolving into category manager 2.0 these days, where they are more data analytics oriented, more customer oriented, more customer centric, more stakeholder management, business partner integration. And yeah, that's how I see it.
So there's a great question from Don. I actually want to ask you about data in a minute, both of you, but there's a question from Don that I think is interesting that I want to pose to both, and I'll pose to you, Jaime, first. From my experience of stakeholders, this is from Don. My experience, stakeholders usually have excellent knowledge of their existing suppliers, but very limited knowledge of the complete market and what that looks like. How do we bring that to the table? If we're looking at perhaps a different model, not necessarily going the traditional category management model?
And that's where I believe here is another ancillary access to the whole procure to pay or source to pay model in technology, which is we need to get rid of talking about supplier portals and be talking more about supplier networks. So if today you want to know what are the options for me to buy this plastic cup, people, where does the stakeholder look at for that information and data? And that is where I believe the value of the supplier networks come to play, where you see what are the options out there in the marketplace, right? And you have access to all that information to see what are the top suppliers, how are they ranked, where do they serve, what are the industries they are, what are the certifications, and all that kind of information. That's the way that I see it. If you have access to that type of technology to give you that type of information.
Okay, so the answer isn't necessarily it's changing that from your perspective. It's changing that the mindset of how you get data. Where do you access data from? You know, traditionally it's either I know it because I've been in the industry for a long time, or I know the right people to ask, or I know how to use Google all afternoon and see what I can find, versus actually here's a supply discovery portal, let's just say, that tells me this is who everybody else is using, this is what they think of them, this is what their capabilities are. There's your supplier list.
We go back to technology every time. Where can I find the data that I'm looking for to do my job better as a strategic sourcing expert?
Nancy, I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think I'd answer a little bit differently. I agree with what you said, but I think I'd also answer a little bit differently. To me, this is about process. So if we think about what exactly is the process that we execute on behalf of the organization, to me, it's about also uncovering what's happening in the marketplace. Who are the suppliers? A point here was made by Peter. The reality here is a lot of times that business owner is informed by their incumbent supplier who clearly has a point of view. So part of our role in our process is to really uncover and essentially deliver facts. You know, what's happening in the market, who are alternative suppliers, kind of, as you said before, Jaime, kind of burst through those kind of portal ideas and really talk about what's happening in the marketplace. This is where I use the phrase positive tension, because a lot of times our stakeholders don't want to hear it. They're very comfortable in their current relationship. But again, if you can quantify what you're trying to deliver in terms of value, take something that's very unquantifiable and actually quantify it and actually bring meaning to it, that's how you drive the conversation forward. But it is tension. But I think that's the real skill set of a strategic sourcing leader, negotiator, both internally and externally. I've often said in my organization that we spend equal parts negotiating internally as we do externally. And sometimes those internal negotiations are even tougher. But I would say that once you get through a few with a particular stakeholder, you kind of build that credibility and trust that you can work, I call it partnering, much more seamlessly going forward. I think that's really what we're striving for, is to be able to get momentum internally to start really driving our conversations externally.
You know, we talk about data a lot, and I'm a really big believer. I talk a lot about the fact that we have to show up with insights and data that go beyond what our stakeholder has for them to really take us seriously as somebody who can play a strategic role within our organization. And Jaime, I see you pulling faces, so I'm going to come to you on that in a second, but I want to ask from Nancy, your perspective, as you think about, because you're in a more mature procurement organization that has more legacy, so that means more legacy is more, you know, fixed historical cost and investment and perhaps technology. You know, then some of that technology may be fit for purpose and some of that technology may not be fit for purpose. You know, how do you think about accessing the data that you're going to start to need when perhaps what you have access to today doesn't give you everything to go to kind of the vision, as you will, in terms of how you want the team to evolve? So
I think about spend analysis. 5 years ago, we thought spend analysis was going to be the secret sauce and solve all of our problems, right? Mm-hmm. It was be the secret recipe to give us all the insights we needed. And I don't know about other practitioners on the call, but I've been extraordinarily disappointed in spend analysis. And it is, you know, at fractional in terms of what I expected to deliver in terms of what it's actually delivering. So I guess I'm a little cautious, Phil, because I believe in AI. I believe in all the things that we're investing in. But it's almost like, you know, the car that the minute you drive it off the parking lot, is it already depreciating? It's already losing value. So for me, it's about creating and identifying those true points of data excellence that we can build on, not as sort of this again, secret sauce kind of solution that's going to solve all of our problems. So I think we've all grown up enough in the last 5 years to recognize that there's not going to be a magic bullet for any of this, that we live in an incredibly complex, world within our organizations. I have legacy infrastructure that I have to somehow dismantle, plug other things into, and I'm sure a lot of us are facing something very similar. So I don't think there's a singular solution, Phil. I think it's a combination of things, but I would just caution that I think we're all getting calls from great companies that have great tools, but there is not a secret sauce.
Yeah. So as you think about that, like where do you think, hey, this is the area that I'm going to go next? Like, let's say there's all these different things, because obviously you have, as you say, lots of different options in terms of technology that you could bring into your organization. How do you prioritize what you think may have the I don't want to say the biggest impact, but it's, you're kind of thinking it on a linear basis. The biggest impact now that helps you continue to go on that journey.
So I think for me, any organization that's talking about procure to pay, and Jaime spoke to this, that has to be the foundation, because everything really is served by a sound and foundationally strong procure to pay process. But in terms of from a strategic sourcing perspective, the ability to analyze, slice and dice, and understand your spend is our path to success. Yeah. I've talked to you before, Phil, about tail spend has been the biggest headache of mine for the last 5 years. We have to figure out ways to be able to address all of our spend, not just our top performing spend with our top suppliers, but tail, all of it. Understand, facilities and maintenance and spend differently, because the reality is we can't continue to go out and source the same categories the same way and deliver outstanding and continued sustainable results, right? If I go out for floor care one more time, the same way I did it 3 years ago, I'm not going to be able to deliver any value, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah, you kind of, the value you're delivering is just in line with market, and it's not giving you any advantage over anybody. Jaime, as you're thinking about tech, because you're coming from a different perspective, in that, well, you said it's not entirely a blank canvas. You don't necessarily have a lot of the legacy challenges or technology that are implemented that most organizations will do. So how do you think about what's the tech that's going to drive the insights and get the data for me that is going to help me to take this role in the organization?
Well, you need to own the situation, right? So you need to build a business case. You need to persuade your organization to invest in technology and stop the conversation that if, but when we jump into the whole train of the machine learning and deep learning and AI, and how we are more dynamic, more agile, and we make it happen. You really need to start having those conversations, and within your own organization to establish, okay, how my procurement function is more tech oriented, and we put more data driven centric mindset here. Now, if that is not a choice, okay, what do you have, right? So if you have a legacy ERP system called the SAPs or the Oracles of the world, okay, you need to play with it. And as Nancy just mentioned, maybe it's going to be more challenging and more complicated, but you need to figure out a way to pull all that data, to make it accessible, and to try to drive decisions. Now, it's going to make it more complicated, more challenging, and way slower for your function, no doubt. But that is where you need to own it. And what I mean by that is, like, we cannot expect as procurement professionals that the IT function come to us and say, hey, I want to implement a new software system for you to do your job better. No, you need to own it, and you need to push that, and you need to tell them which is your platform that you want to operate.
I think if you don't do that, you run the risk of them coming and telling you what they're going to use, and that might not be fit for your purpose. And then something that you're stuck with for a long time. You kind of see that a lot. Now, Tim made a great point. Data and spend analytics is really important. Doesn't necessarily unlock the insights of the category, the competitive landscape, the value derived by the supplier in the relationship. I wonder if you just have any thoughts on, is technology going to ultimately deliver us a category strategy, so to speak, and say, here it is on a plate based on all these different dynamics, or what's the human role still going to be in using the data that you're going to be able to present to them to turn all that data into those kind of insights that end up being actionable?
Yeah, the way that I see it from my perspective is, and as Nancy mentioned, it's going to be an hybrid model, right? So it's not going to be one size fits all and one solution is going to be applicable for everything. You need to differentiate what is indirect and direct first, and then go into specific industries and niche markets or niche categories. And that is going to be a different type of approach. Now, can you automate most of all that pieces? I think so. I think is pretty, even though inside the category you can divide and conquer and see what can be more technology oriented, data driven, and what still needs some human interaction. That's what I said. It has to take tremendous relevance, the whole supply relationship program that you implement in your company. So to be sure that you are dealing with the right vendors at the right level, with the right levels of quality and compliance and deliverables that you're looking for, and how connected as part of that strategy are all those business partners with your function and with your with your procurement team. So the category strategy will become, rather than a good 100 pages document in your hard disk, something that is more alive, something that is more agile, something that is more dynamic on how we operate as an ecosystem in this procurement world. That's my vision on this.
And Phil, I don't know. I think, last year taught us a lot, right? And unfortunately, it continues now because this pandemic does not want to seem to end. For me, I really saw the value more of, I'm going to call the human relationship or human part of what we do in terms of practitioners. And I think automation is going to elevate what our teams do, but I don't think it's ever going to replace it. I think it's going to elevate the way we make decisions, the choices we make, the quality of the data in which we make decisions from. But I still see, and again, I saw it more last year and continue to, as I said before, into this year, the absolute critical importance of the relationship building between ourselves and our supplier community. And you think about how, sourcing and procurement organizations started, we were sort of the most hated element of our organizations, right? Because we essentially intersected between the category or the business partner and the vendor. Now we're the trusted partner to most of our suppliers, even more so than their business partner. But I think also within our own teams, our responsibility as we deploy technology is to essentially inform them and advise them in terms of what we expect. And I think the word that Jaime used, agility, is the most critical one. We're looking for agility. We're not looking for people to work harder. We want them to work smarter, faster, in service of being able to deliver the right solutions, the right choices, the right decisions as quickly as we can.
So I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, and you may have in part answered the last question I was actually going to throw at you. I'm going to ask you first, Nancy, then come over to Jaime. If you have somebody who's listening today, or maybe it's somebody on your team that is a category manager and they're an expert in a particular category, or they know enough about the category, to make a difference for their business, what advice would you give them in terms of how they think about, what should we be doing from a career perspective as procurement's evolving to kind of evolve with procurement?
I think the most important word here is curiosity. So I don't think category-led is necessarily dead, which I think is the way you kind of phrased this initially. I think it's evolving, and I think the way it's going to evolve is with curiosity. I think the success of procurement is that we're curious. We wonder why. When a stakeholder says something or says, it must be this way, well, we ask why, and we go into the market and try to uncover other solutions. I would encourage them to be curious and to continue to find new ways to be successful and to understand that status quo will never get us to where we need to go to. But again, I would probably just underline the word curiosity for all of us, but particularly for those in a category-led structure.
I love it. Yeah, none of us know entirely where things are going to go. So you say that curiosity is really important. Jaime, what advice would you give?
So in my opinion, category management as we know it is dead, or should be dead as we know it. Now, what the role most likely should shift is from task-driven to automated rule-based creation with a tremendous appetite for analytics and interpretation skills, curiosity, as Nancy mentioned, the rule-based thinking, and more forward-looking into those predictive analytics. That's the way that I see it. It should address all these issues and all these situations with circular economy concept and compliance, be more customer-centric, and generate the business opportunities looking at the full value of the supply chain rather than one aspect, with agility, with flexibility, responsiveness, and customer service oriented.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.